Today, it is hard to go online without seeing some kind of commentary about social media, online trolls, polarization, silos. And I want to start with a promise. I promise that today, everything that I say will not be all doom and gloom. But some of it will be, just a little bit. We're technologists, and so today I'd like to talk about what we can actually do about this problem. To understand who I am, we need to go back a little bit in time. And so I'd like to take us back to 2003, when speculation on what was going to happen in the 5th Harry Potter book was at an all-time, fever pitch high. At least for me and my new online friends. Okay, maybe we should have gone back a little further in time. Hi, my name is Kamilah Taylor, and I'm a huge Harry Potter fan. And to know me is to know that, yes, do I have any other Harry Potter fans in the house? Yes? Thank you, thanks. Really glad I'm not the only one out there. Let's see, so I thought I would represent a rough translation of my life story in emojis. So I'm from the tiny island of Jamaica, where we're pretty small. And growing up, I moved back and forth a bunch between the US and Jamaica, and I actually currently live in San Francisco. A lot of people get a little bit confused, when I say I'm from Jamaica, because I don't fit all the stereotypes. I do love Bob Marley, yes, it's like a requirement. But, I'm not fast. I actually really hate running. So I just, like to clarify, not all Jamaicans are as fast as this guy. Let's see, so at some point I moved back to Jamaica and I went to college there, where I studied computer science and math. And then I moved to Illinois, where I studied robotics. That's one of my robots. The name was Hal. Reference intended, without the killing humans part. And so I studied robotics there for a while before dropping out of the PhD. And then, PhD dropouts? No? Okay, maybe just me. And so I dropped out of the PhD. I started working at Wolfram Research, where I was, again, doing some work in robotics, working on Mathematica. And then I moved out to the Bay Area, where I worked at LinkedIn for 5.5 years. I was really lucky to be able to work on a lot of projects, lots of features and apps, including the massive Swift rewrite we did back in 2015. And let's see, somewhere in there, I wrote the chapter in a book called Women in Tech, and I drank lots and lots of coffee, including this morning, to get myself ready for this. I love travel, and I have too many books. So I think that's probably enough about me. So let's talk more about Harry Potter. Okay, no. But I am going to talking about Harry Potter online. Because as it turns out, that's one of my first experiences being part of an online community, was talking about Harry Potter in online forums. So yes, this is a Harry Potter forum that's dedicated, it was called Chamber of Secrets. And again, this is, we had this 3-year break, I think, between books 4 and 5. And so all these online communities kind of formed up around it. And, the time was just ripe, right? We had this massive dedicated fandom, and then the technology was also creeping up to join that. And I think of online forums as a little bit as the good old days of talking online, right? We had a really great community, and really great community, and you can see already in online forums some of the first examples of the mechanisms for increasing user engagement. For example, Let's see, there's a lot of stuff that they did to try to get the desired behavior out of users. So they awarded points for those things. For example, for asking questions, right? So if you asked a question or if you answered a question, you got extra points. I think you got extra privileges once you got those extra points. If you helped with moderation, you got those extra points and badges. And then, of course, if you were really active frequently, you also got a bunch of extra points. And so all of these were all tailored around increasing user engagement. And I think in online forums, this is where you really started seeing us moving past just talking online to also seeing how can we get users more active. And so this is, and of course, this is not the first instance of that. Back, starting in the 90s, maybe even the 80s, depending on where you were, we had a bunch of examples of these. And interestingly, a lot of these were, they were sort of isolated within certain networks, right? So your company network or your university network, especially, that's how I grew up seeing this. My dad is a computer science professor, and I remember seeing him use ICQ, et cetera, back in the day, but they're all still pretty closed networks, right? And so there's a lot of fragmentation in this, and until we get to the messengers, right? And that's maybe for many of us in here our first entrance into this market. And so in the US, AIM was pretty popular. I know in Jamaica, MSN Messenger was more popular. I'm not sure what it was in Europe, but we had these different messengers. Again, discoverability wasn't great. You mostly, I think, would talk with your friends. There was some amount of talking to strangers and finding interesting usernames, et cetera. And there are a lot of mechanisms around that, but it was still sort of hard to get that discoverability to be able to find those other people. And one more thing I'd like to note is that with the messenger family of communication, we started to creep towards real-time communication. We still weren't always connected, so you didn't actually necessarily know when people are on. Maybe you would prearrange times, but we were getting real-time communication in a way that we necessarily weren't getting before with the forums. Okay, so as I mentioned, they lack discoverability. They're still sort of insular and fragmented. They didn't always feel real time. And so I think all of this started to change, and fueled by primarily three movements. The first is that we started to have the rise of the giant social networks. First it were the MySpaces and the Friendsters, the Facebooks, the Twitters, et cetera. And so we got a bunch of these, and because you started to be able to you were able to depend that everybody would be in this space. And then, of course, smartphones, and that got to the always on, right? Always being able to communicate, which facilitated more real-time communication. And then mobile messaging, which again sort of arose out of smartphones, right? Once we moved away from text messaging to the various messaging apps, the Facebook Messengers, WhatsApps of the world, et cetera. And this is really where I think we saw a massive shift in how we were talking online. And so great, everyone can talk to anyone in real time all the time. We'll all be connected and we'll all be learning more, and everything has been democratized. Everything's great, everything's awesome, right? Yeah? Maybe not necessarily. So it's not really what happened. And for me, I think this is encapsulated when I think of 2016, right? So in 2016, it was the first time in my life where I could really find myself actively avoiding posting certain things on Facebook. And it was mostly because I was afraid of this, the different flame wars that had started to erupt. And interestingly, it wasn't because it was like a Democrats versus Republicans thing. It was actually like infighting within like many of like my Democrat friends, like Bernie versus Hillary, which it's 2018 and it's still Bernie versus Hillary, which is just driving me a little bit crazy. But this is a time where you started to see like everything come to like a head. And then Brexit happened. And I was like traveling at the time. I remember being like totally shocked because I'd sort of known that this like vote was happening nebulously, but everyone had sort of treated it as a joke, at least on my networks, within my networks. And so we had no clue that something was going to happen. And we all thought this was laughable, but here we were. So we were all clearly wrong as a sign of things to come. And so all of a sudden, I started to feel really overwhelmed by the fact that we're all talking to each other online all the time, every time, right? Like I started to dread opening up like my phone in the morning. And it didn't feel like we were learning from each other. The conversations no longer felt productive. And it felt like the trolls had like a massive amount of power in any conversation that happened. And I want to clarify something here. 2016 is definitely not the first time that I saw this dynamic happening. I actually think a couple years before this, where there are like a series of cases of different women being harassed off the internet, basically, and various incidents. A lot of them women of color, right? And where this harassment, people started to like team up together. And I saw this like happening actually like in real time once in Reddit. I really saw like the power of a group of people being able to form a narrative against another group of people. And so this had been happening for a while. It just sort of bled out of those like different microcosms into the real world in 2016. And so you had to ask ourselves, how did we build a system that allowed this to foster in so many different ways? It wasn't just one platform, right? I would say that it was maybe there in like all of the platforms. In tech, we trained ourselves to motivate users to click more, to download our apps, to share more, to invite more users, spend more time. And these are engagement metrics, right? We all know these. And it doesn't matter if you're an engineer or you're a designer or you're a product manager or you're in biz dev. Like, these are the metrics that everybody is paying attention to. But there has to be something more. And I would say here that our blind attention, narrow attention to just these metrics is what got us here. Yeah, it's also. And so what did we forget to measure? There's a lot of interesting research demonstrating the polarization that's happening online. This one is pretty interesting. So this is looking at red Twitter versus blue Twitter, Republicans versus Democrats. And we had this research where they're looking at sharing and how it's happening within these ideological networks. And so you can see that actually the different clusters are really not talking to each other that much. And the way they came up with this is pretty interesting. I think they were able to look within their following networks to determine what their ideological bent is. And overall, they found far more here this graph I think is particularly about retweets, and so they found far more in-group retweets than out-group retweets. And one other interesting thing here is that especially the in-group versus out-group retweets is especially around polarizing topics like climate change and gun control. At least, again, this is within the context of the US. And a lot of these examples will be within the context of the US, but again, as I mentioned with Brexit, right, this is not a US-specific problem. Here's another group of researchers, and they're actually looking at trolls. And there are a lot of like these paid troll accounts that they found, and a lot of them were discovered, I think, within like the last year or so. And even for these, it's again like split. So you're seeing like left-leaning troll accounts are mostly being retweeted by left-leaning accounts, and similarly, like right-leaning troll accounts are like mostly being retweeted by like the right-leaning accounts. So we're really, really split. Even like in like we talk about like trolling online, but it's actually we're almost like entirely interacting with people who like form or same opinions. Here's the problem. Polarization keys engagement, and engagement and attention are what keeps us on the platforms. This is not a coincidence. We already showed you how we measure user engagement on platforms. Polarization only helps with that engagement. And so by blindly measuring those metrics, we've actually helped polarization foster. It's not new. You can look back in history, like many times in history, and see like various like moments of like massive political polarization. But the problem is that polarization comes with companions: authoritarianism, propaganda, and misinformation. And we're in a really dangerous time to allow this to like happen. And so here, I want to break out of just looking at what we're seeing within the networks, like digitally, and look at some data that's just happening outside of that. And so this is from Pew Research. And you can see the increase in polarization over the last 2 decades. And in particular, look at the difference in 1994 to 2004 versus 2004 to 2014. You remember I started my talk thinking about 2003. Look at that difference between 2004 and 2014. It's massive. It's way larger than the previous decade. So this is bleeding out from our digital like lives and into our real lives. We're actually seeing like a real increase in political polarization. Again, we can see like more examples. This is from like the same Pew Research study, where both sides like think that they're the enemy more and more over time, right? And they think like not even just that they're enemy, that like the other side is like dangerous and a threat to to society. This is not great. We can't have both sides thinking that the other side is just like a threat, right? Like there has to be more than this. And then again, one more like graph that's showing this. And here I thought this was interesting. So the Pew Research study, they actually called out a couple of factors that contribute to political polarization or stem from it. And they have a later report that actually goes into this, and they list 3 main sources. One is people's news sources, their social media habits, and their interpersonal communication networks. And so we can see that we're seeing the connection here between what's happening digitally and what's happening in real life. The second big thing I think that we haven't paid attention to is empathy. This is a little bit disturbing. So apparently there's actually been like a huge decrease in empathy over American college students over time. And you can actually see a really sharp decrease that starts to happen around the year 2000. Again, around the time that we're seeing a change in our online habits. Tech can help with, I would say, increasing shared experiences, but it can also help with fostering cyberbullying. And then there's a third piece of this. We have like the fave, the retweet, the upvote, the reshares, and how much like kudos and credit you get for those things. And we tapped into another psyche. I'd like to call it like the vanity or the narcissism sort of psyche, where you get like social approval or validation. And unfortunately, because like these are all sort of empty metrics in how the content gets like shared or viewed, that means that we're also getting a lot of sensationalist content, because that is also going to like attract a lot of outrage, right? And so we get all of this like outrageous like content that's like spilling out, and this is something that, again, we designed the system to be able to do that. There's actually some research here on this as well, where they've actually seen an increase in narcissism and there you can see it tracking as well with an increase in social media. Of course, then they like call out the millennials or whatever, and like they all care about themselves. But it's very much that we've built a lot of systems where you get value from social validation. You may think that this has peaked, but the next generation of social apps might be even worse. So there are now apps where teenagers are exchanging time and or money to show that they super like the popular kids, or that, yeah, this is real, or that like kids are like the popular kids are like spending hours every day like streaming just like their everyday lives, and then they like I think kids, like, they're able to exchange like time or like money, of course, in cryptocurrency to be able to like get attention from the popular kids. And this is really, really disturbing to me, because I think middle school was like traumatic enough without like having an extra like measure where I have to, I need to like get all this cryptocurrency so I can get attention from this really popular kid. Like that just seems like, I don't know, like some sort of post-apocalyptic like scenario, right? But this is real. These are real apps that are being used right now. Okay, so I promised that I wouldn't be all doom and gloom. And in the last year, I've actually seen a massive uptick in public awareness around this topic, and even in some amount of tech leadership awareness. And in this vein, I'd like to talk about a project that I've been working on called Sway. The morning after the 2016 election, I had this like really gnawing sensation that I had seen the evidence of this for so long. And I kept thinking like, man, like I'm an engineer, like shouldn't we have like built something? Like, isn't there something that we should have done to like seen this, like we saw this coming. I knew that something wasn't like great about what was going on. Later that week, I had a conversation with who became our second co-founder, where he said something really interesting to me. He said, what if we like centered conversations around thoughtfulness? It seemed so simple, but it kind of hit upon one of the things that I'd felt had gone all wrong. In real life, if someone like starts like yelling at you in your face or like continues an argument, you could just walk away. But online, these people get rewarded and amplified, right? Some people will express shock, and then there's some amount of people who are like glee, like, oh yes, this is something that I've always thought. I'm so glad that someone finally said this. Maybe referencing recent events, but who can tell which one? Because it's like every week there's something else like shocking that somebody says. And so one of our big goals is actually to try and bring normalcy and civility back into how we interact with each other online. And to be able to give us a chance to be able to interact with people across an opinion spectrum in a more thoughtful way. Separately, who became my third co-founder, Daniel Burke, he had actually had this idea, multiple times. And it started because he had this like group of friends where they were all like really supremely different from each other. Their ideas were super different. And he had always thought, like, why isn't there an online platform where I could have like the type of conversations that I have with these friends? Since then, he'd actually worked on this project, I think, 4 times. This might be his fourth time at it. And so, 2016, he was like, man, this has like never been more necessary. Like, I really have to like bring this back to like fruition. It's not enough to just find your tribe online. Yes, this is really important. I've made like great friends online. It's amazing when you have that like group that like those people that you have found, but it can't be the only thing. We have to be able to talk to each other about topics that are quite frankly really hard. They don't have simple answers, but we actually have to be able to like talk with each other to find that like middle ground. Our first beta, Sway, yes, it's in beta and test flight, and our first beta actually takes a digest of topics that are usually something like sort of contentious. This is one that we did maybe like a couple months ago. And we get users to rank it on thoughtfulness, and we're also like finding where they like agree, disagree. And one of the great things that we've seen is that like people are actually able to make that distinction, right? Just because like you can say that this person has a point doesn't mean that I agree with you. And that's something that we've really lost somewhere in the last decade or so. And so it's been really fascinating to see the types of conversations that we're actually getting on like very difficult topics. Okay, so what can you do? Well, you could sign up for the beta at thesway.com. Seriously, you could do that. We're testing in test flight. Still pretty early, but we're bringing in people and advice as we like test this. But that's not it. One of the biggest things I think you could do is to get informed from people who are doing the work. So I have a handful of people who've informed a lot of my thinking here. A couple of them that I was like stand up are, for instance, Twitter and Tear Gas. It's a really fascinating book that goes into the history of like online communication and various social movements and civic disruptions. It's really, really great. And it goes through the ups and downs, like how it both like helped fuel some of them and actually how like propaganda, et cetera, has helped to like hurt some of them later on. And so this is a really fascinating, albeit maybe like depressing read, but if you're looking for a little bit of a downer, definitely read this book. Positive computing, I think I'll go into that, one of the most valuable frameworks I got out of that in a second. Addiction by design, again, we'll look at how we've been building technology to be more addictive. And then, of course, Tristan Harris, who's been a really big proponent of time well spent. He's, I think, ex-Facebook, ex-Google. But there are a bunch of people who are in this who have worked at various like social companies. And then Algorithms of Repression. It's a really great read by Safia, who's actually also Illinois alum. But she goes through a lot of how many of our algorithms, and especially like search recommendation algorithms, have actually fueled some racist and sexist things. And we've seen this come out recently, for instance, like in the YouTube recommendations. You can see that in like search box recommendations, et cetera. And these are all really necessary. I think we all, like as technologists, we have to know like what's going on here. What is like the social impacts and fallout of our technology? The second thing that I would love if we all do is if we always, it doesn't matter like how cool like you think this like feature or product is, we have to ask how this can harm people. It doesn't mean that you're not necessarily going to build this, but you can build it with mechanisms where you're thinking about how this could fall out in some way. And we have to do this. I'll never forget when I was at LinkedIn, and we had these like monthly hack days, and I did this like hack day project around blocking, because at the time there was no way to block members on LinkedIn. And I remember afterwards, people came up to me and they were like, how did you think of this? Like member-to-member blocking, like how did you think of like doing that for your Hack Day project? It's like, well, I had a stalker. I saw him show up on my who viewed my profile, and I got really upset that there was no way for me to block him on LinkedIn. And there was this like shock. They were like, really? Like people have stalkers in real life? It's like, yes. Are you kidding me? Like LinkedIn has been around for almost like a decade now, and nobody thought about this. You have to think about it. Everyone has to think about it, and it can't be enough to just like only rely on like on your own experience, right? Like you have to think about like how the technology can be used for bad. So positive computing, they have this value-sensitive designers framework that I thought was really interesting and that we can all like think of, even as engineers, et cetera. So think about like what is important to you, and then this is like my favorite like part is think about not just who's going to use the system, but who is also going to be affected by the system, right? Because many times you'll build something and there are people who are not users, but they're still going to be affected and have like a fallout somehow. Think about how this is going to benefit and or harm each stakeholder. And then we can like map this benefit and harm onto a list of values, and that's how you'll learn about what your like key values are. And then also a really important thing is to identify conflicting values. For instance, like trust versus security, right? Or privacy versus security. And that's like a big thing, fallout that I think we've seen a lot, especially in the last year, right? You know, with like Cambridge Analytica, et cetera. Like many of our things in our products have like conflicting values. It might benefit you to have like a really open platform where like lots of developers can use your data. But that might also mean that you've now like weakened the security of your platform, and you have to think about this. And finally, and then incorporate those values, like so that you're thinking about this like all the time, every day. It's not just like a nice to have. It has to be a must do. Like this has to be something that we do every day. I want to emphasize this point. Technology is not going to solve everything. There are many things that require policy changes, political participation, some amount of personal responsibility in how we are using technology and how we're allowing our children to use technology, et cetera. And that has to be part of this conversation. But we have to admit that technology impacts the world. As technologists, we have a moral obligation. And when I say technologists, I mean all of us. The engineers in the room, the designers, the product managers. We have a moral obligation to at least make a positive difference where we can. Thank you.